look, why is Friends of the Earth talking to you about energy security? And thanks again for signing in. I'm going to move fairly quickly. The reason we are talking to you about energy security is because there is a major risk that Ireland becomes locked in to fossil fuels for the long term. One of the main justifications for long-term fossil fuel infrastructure is energy security. There's a particular risk around lock-in to gas, and we believe that there is means and ways of ensuring energy security while respecting our climate obligations. And as I mentioned, the reason we are actually here today is to try and help you respond to the government's consultation, and responses are due in by the 28th of October. So not this Friday, next Friday. The background, this is maybe just a little bit of a policy background. Back in 2019, it was actually Minister Bruton under the last government started this process, kicked off this process of a review of Ireland's energy security. At that stage, it was in the context of moving towards 70% of our electricity generation from renewables. That commitment is now 80%, but this actually began in 2019, and that review and that analysis has been progressing in various guises through the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications since then. And we've had important policy developments, including a major moratorium on fracked gas, on LNG, liquefied natural gas, and fracked gas imports was introduced in 2021. And this was a moratorium pending the outcome, essentially the progression of this energy security review, so that LNG terminals it would not be appropriate to proceed with them. This is a government position, and it still is until this review is complete. Since then, Shannon LNG submitted another planning application, and also since then, we've had the introduction of a new climate law with binding emissions obligations to reduce emissions, so 51% reduction by 2030. And you may have heard about this year about the introduction of carbon budgets and sectoral emission ceilings. I do not propose to go through them, but they are very important because they're placing obligation on the state and on relevant bodies to reduce emissions in accordance with those targets. There's also been a policy statement on security of electricity supply, which I might return to, and a national energy security framework, which is mainly in response to the challenges and complications caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also a policy statement on petroleum exploration, again, which I might return to and briefly mention. And obviously, while this process started in 2019, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has put a very different slant on things, has made things challenging, obviously, as you all already know, not only for Ireland, but for all of Europe. It's mainly hit Ireland in the context of energy bills, also, as we all know, God help us, over the winter. And there is a lot of EU policy and responses to this as well, which I do not propose to go through here, but the likes of the Repower EU initiative is very relevant. So if I try to move to the next slide. So as I said, we want you in terms of today to have your say to help you respond to this, this consultation. It's quite important, or what's quite important here is that the government has produced an independent technical analysis by consultants as part of this consultation. That sounds like a god-awful mouthful. Why is it important? How is this different? The government contracted an independent consultancy called SEPA to provide their own independent assessment of Ireland's energy security challenges, and they have published that. So we now have the ability to respond to that, and I am going to go through that a little bit towards the end. And yes, so without further ado, I'll move on to the next slide. So energy security, what is it and what isn't it? this is me basically now trying to give you some background before actually getting into the consultation. So, as the SEAI have said, it relates to our import dependency, fuel diversity, and capacity. But it's open to exploitation, as I said at the beginning, because fossil fuel companies have tended to use energy security as the justification for any and all additional infrastructure. Now, Ireland is quite dependent on fossil fuels, so 100% of our oil and over 70% of our fossil methane gas was imported in 2021. And equally, another element which energy security analysis tend to factor in is the diversity of supply. Where does Ireland have a dependence on particular sources or particular routes, and what's the likelihood of those sources or routes being disrupted, which I'm going to come on to. The next point is, what isn't it? Maybe perhaps a slightly strange way of putting it, but it is really important to differentiate. It is absolutely fundamentally central to differentiate between security of gas supply and security of electricity supply. We are going to find out that obviously our electricity, or not obviously, we're going to find out that gas is used to generate electricity. So there is a link between the two of them, but we shouldn't confuse measures relating to gas, the flow of gas into Ireland. We shouldn't confuse that with the security of generating our electricity. Or to put that another way, if we were to build a pipeline directly from Ireland to Russia, that would have zero impact on the current challenges in our electricity system at the moment. So you may have heard, you may be aware around, there's been challenges with generation of electricity going back a couple of years now, which are mainly to do with older power stations and new power stations not coming online, problems with older ones, and rising demand. But providing additional power stations is very different to whether we need more gas infrastructure. So that's just a really central point for everyone to be aware of at the start. And what should energy security take account of? What's quite interesting and to a certain extent disappointing is that when this whole process started, it was called a review, or called by government, a review of energy security and sustainability. In other words, we have to take account of our climate obligations and decarbonisation objectives. And that's absolutely central. In other words, when government makes decisions on energy security, it has to take into consideration and actively adhere to our climate obligations. And there are co-benefits here. So obviously, where we're using less fossil fuels because we're using, for example, more renewables, that is a good thing for Ireland's energy security, to be less dependent on fossil fuel imports. And a little bit linking back to the point above on security of supply, there's an elephant in the room around demand. So one important way to have less pressure on our electricity and gas systems is to reduce demand in any way we can. So that could be through energy efficiency measures. It's one way of reducing demand. There are other ways, other more substantive ways, and you may already be aware that we have very significant demand pressures on the electricity system from increasing connection of data centers. So that is another response which you might return to at the end. But what you will continuously find in the media is references to supply and not references to demand. And maybe just for the purposes of today, I will not have time to get into heating and transport. Obviously, we use fossil fuels in our heating, and obviously oil in our petrol and diesel in our cars. not to mention aviation and other very problematic areas where there's still a high dependency on fossil fuels. I won't have the opportunity to cover that in depth, and actually the consultation doesn't get into heating and transport in any depth. They are relevant, but we just won't have the opportunity to go through that in too much detail. Moving on to the next slide. I do not want to scare you with this. So this is from the SEAI, a flow chart of energy flows in Ireland in 2018. So this is a bit out of date. What I really just wanted to highlight to you here is, on the one hand, you can see this graph shows quite neatly, or this chart rather, that a lot of gas, or natural gas, fossil methane gas, is used in electricity generation. It also shows that we're majorly dependent on oil, as I said, in our transport system. It also shows, it highlights the use of renewables in electricity, which is increasing, which I'm going to come on to. And then if I move on to the next slide, in terms of the gas system, so what I want to do now is, this is a little bit of background on our gas system and on our electricity system. So first of all, on the gas system, where does gas come from into our gas system? 25% of it comes from the Carib field, and 75% of it comes from Moffat, which is a point in Scotland. So in other words, we get 75% of our gas via the UK, and that comes across in two interconnectors from Moffat, and those interconnectors, as you'll see here, those interconnectors from Moffat, which is in the top right, it goes across Scotland, and then there's a spur over to Northern Ireland, and we have two major interconnectors over to Ireland, and there's a connection into the Isle of Man. This is I appreciate this is a lot of information. What I really want you to highlight is the Irish state has invested billions, I don't have an exact figure, but it's a big one, in ensuring there is two subsea interconnectors from Scotland to Ireland. So here I guess I'm looking at the security of our gas supply. And it's also worth noting that Northern Ireland and the Isle of Man are part of the same subsea network system. So when people consider risks of gas flows to Ireland, it's worth taking into account that there are other jurisdictions which are equally dependent. So this maybe links in with this idea that there's someone simply going to turn off the tap in London. That is not a realistic scenario. Also, in terms of gas, just to be clear, Ireland is not dependent in any way, shape or form on Russian gas. Now, the events in the past year or so have affected Ireland. They do pose a risk for gas flows to the UK, but the UK is actually, and as I said, that's where we get the majority of our gas imports. The UK is in a better position than most jurisdictions because the UK itself is not dependent on Russian gas. There's a lot in that, but it's worth being aware. Now, what's gas used for, or in terms of demand? You'll see there, I just really want to highlight with this that a significant percentage is used for, as here, thermal power plants, for electricity generation. And again, if I move on to the next slide, what's also important to consider is that again, needing to factor in considerations around demand. This is an older graph from the SEAI, but a point I really want to hammer home, whether we have a high gas demand scenario or a low gas demand scenario, even looking at that green line, green dotted line. In order to meet our climate obligations, Ireland's dependence on gas needs to rapidly reduce. So that means that that green line needs to start moving towards zero as we go into the 2030s and 2040s. So there is a major issue around Ireland's climate obligations not being taken into consideration when particular public bodies are producing projections of gas and electricity demand. And you may have heard, I'm sure you have heard, and it's a really central piece of Friends of the Earth's campaigning. What about liquefied natural gas? Well, liquefied natural gas is essentially where gas is liquefied in another country, brought over to Ireland by, or brought over to another country by ship, and it's then turned back into a gas. And obviously the most well-known potential gas terminal in Ireland, there's a few prospective terminals, but the one that's the most plans are most progressed for is Shannon LNG. And one of the reasons why LNG is put forward in terms of providing a bigger boost to our gas supply or adding to energy security, or I guess the contention is that we are the Corrib field, the supplies from that are reducing. They're, I think, projected to be significantly reduced in the next 5 years or so. And therefore, Ireland will be even more dependent on imports from Scotland. Now, there's a few issues here, but just to purely looking at the issue of LNG, if an LNG terminal is built, it will lock Ireland into use of fossil gas for decades to come. So when a major piece of infrastructure is built, it'll be used. It will supply Ireland with with significant volumes of polluting fossil methane gas. It won't solve the current energy crisis. It'll obviously take a number of years to be built. So in terms of what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, it is not an immediate answer. It'll also, the other risk is that it provides results in another dependence, essentially a new dependence on imports. That LNG has to come from somewhere. It's a major risk that it comes from a highly polluting activity, fracked gas from the US, which Julia Walsh might touch upon. That's a really major concern of ours, which we can come back to. It's also it's a major source of pollution. There is the risk of leakage of methane, so essentially significant release of gas into the atmosphere. And we would really question the contention that it would result in significant jobs. So one of our main points is that the Shannon LNG terminal will not sufficiently respond to Ireland's gas security concerns. That's the basic point. On the electricity system, we have a connection to Northern Ireland, to Britain. There's a further interconnector planned to France, and also a major expansion of our electricity grid is planned in order to facilitate more offshore wind. As I mentioned before, we have an over-reliance on gas for generation of electricity, but we do have we are actively increasing the amount of electricity that's coming from renewable sources, and we're currently at over 40%, and we have a commitment to move to actually 80% by 2030. And the vast majority of this electricity from renewables comes from wind, and demand from electricity is projected to increase as we electrify our heating system and our transport system. I've already perhaps thrown enough graphs at you now, and I'm conscious that I'm also behind time a little bit here. So what I now want to do briefly, and the only certainty here, and I said this at the start, the only certainty here with talking about energy security is that I leave out something because it's such a broad area. But if we look briefly at the consultation paper itself and this independent technical analysis that I mentioned, the consultation paper provides a summary of the policy context, some of which I've mentioned already. It also provides a summary of the technical analysis. And I'll say to you now that I would prefer for you, if you have the time and energy, to actually look at the consultants, I'm looking for another word other than summary, but the consultant's summary of its technical analysis as opposed to the condensed version that's in the consultation paper. In other words, the consultation paper that's there, I think, doesn't go into the same level of detail or provide the same level of useful information that's in the independent consultant's report. I know you may say, I want to keep my life simple and I have so much time. I only have so much time, but there are parts of the consultant's report which I think are very useful and which I think you can respond to. So long story short, if possible, I wouldn't only rely on or address what's in the actual consultation paper itself. Now, here I've simply set out what are the consultation questions. Broadly speaking, it asks for feedback, broadly speaking, on what's in this independent technical analysis. So what's in this independent technical analysis? I think actually for a report on energy, or an analysis of energy demand and supply, it's relatively accessible. And I think parts of it are actually quite good and quite useful. Now, it provides, just to highlight here, an analysis of shocks to our supply and demand in terms of gas and electricity. It puts forward mitigation options, but crucially, it assesses these options in light of the impact on energy supplies, on costs, and in terms of our climate obligations. And that is, I have to say, well, friends there has to say, that is a positive step. We have not seen across several public bodies this linking, this clear consideration of emissions in assessing options related to energy. It then goes through a long listing and essentially a screening of these options, which I'm going to come on to, and then a short listing. And one thing I would say, I mentioned this at the start, we really have to interrogate electricity and gas demand projections. It uses, understandably, the SEPA consultants used forecasts from Gas Network Ireland in terms of gas demand and EirGrid in terms of electricity demand. But these own state projections do not factor in how Ireland will meet its climate obligations, which is a problem. Now, what does it say? I am not going to do, unfortunately, a thorough job of all of the options, gas supply and electricity supply options it addresses. I'm going to deliberately cherry pick only a couple of the things that report says. And to go back to the previous slide, it is worth looking at table 6.1 on page 82 of that summary of the technical report. And also, I think it's also on pages 96 and 131. That's me trying to just give you a little piece. If you were to read something in that technical report, you could go to those pages. Going back to that slide, what it says. So it rules out, the consultants deliberately, they specifically state that a commercially operated or state-owned LNG terminal, like Shannon LNG, they rule it out as it would result in the importation of fracked gas. It addresses emissions in terms of LNG, the high emissions from LNG, and these volumes wouldn't be sufficient to cover a security of supply shock. It also rules out a commercially operated, emphasis on commercially operated, floating LNG terminal. Floating is a particular type. And it also rules out use of exploration, or offshore exploration. So, for example, adding additional offshore fields, gas fields, in terms of the prospective supply, it rules that out as that additional production could lock Ireland into a high gas energy market, and there's also a high degree of uncertainty. In other words, unknown volumes in terms of those potential gas discoveries. Apologies for getting into the technical detail here, but that is really useful. It's very useful to have independent consultants reject those options so clearly. And then moving on to the next slide, that's what it's now. It rejects other measures as well. I've cherry picked those two in terms of what it shortlists. It shortlists options around green hydrogen, demand reduction, further electricity interconnection, and storage. And it does shortlist two gas infrastructure options in terms of a floating LNG terminal operated as a backup facility, and it also shortlists a state-backed. Again, remember in the previous slide I highlighted it rejected the commercial LNG. It shortlists it shortlists a state-backed gas storage facility as potential, which could provide gas in an emergency. There's a lot in that which I can perhaps return to later, but it's worth highlighting that they are the two gas options which are shortlisted in that report. There are definitely other nuggets in there which would be helpful to highlight in your own response. They touch upon some of the issues which I highlighted earlier. So I just don't want to suggest I've covered all the major issues in it, and it would be worth actually highlighting other points, other issues which you consider to be important. So what I want to do now is, and I see that's incorrectly numbered, I'm going to stop perhaps with the background and the technical detail. What are Friends of the Earth's recommendations at the moment, with the caveat that this is all draft and initial. So a really core principle when the government considers these energy options is that it must align with our climate obligations. So that means we need an assessment of the emissions associated with any measure. So in light of our carbon budgets and our sectoral emission ceilings, apologies that this is getting quite policy wonkery, but essentially, if you're assessing something, we want to know what's the potential impact on our emissions. The health and environmental impacts also need to be reviewed. And we also need to know clarity on how any new infrastructure would be used, and in the case of fossil fuels, how it will be phased out. Another core principle is that we are saying no to LNG. So remember, I said at the start that we have a moratorium on LNG in place. That should be made permanent through legislation. And I think I mentioned before, perhaps I forgot to mention, that there is a ban on for new licenses for fossil fuel exploration. Current licenses should be phased out too. We also need to destroy demand. So this goes back to this idea of that we have all this focus on supply, but not enough focus on demand, particularly in electricity. So we are recommending that that the government introduces a moratorium on new data centres connecting to the grid until electricity system pressures and lock-in risks have been addressed. And there's a lot in this, but the state now needs to start planning for 100% zero carbon electricity system. This is by no means easy, but we are already moving towards it. When, remember, I said that the state is committed to 80% renewable electricity by 2030. And that means prioritizing offshore wind, solar, battery storage, and interconnection. And studies have shown that, like, in terms of the current challenges, these types of measures can significantly reduce, this is obviously at EU level, but Russian gas imports. And I don't have the time to go into this, unfortunately, but carbon capture and storage, which is a way of decarbonizing gas, that unicorn is not going to come and solve all our problems. We need to focus on renewables, demand reduction, etc., and not wait for carbon capture and storage to supposedly come and solve all our problems. Every indication is that it will not. And I'm coming towards the end of this now. We also need to support energy security at household level, and you'd be surprised at how often the risk to households is not really discussed in the media. So we obviously think that energy efficiency is a good idea in terms of reducing our emissions. It's good for energy security too, obviously in terms of reducing our reliance on gas and oil for home heating. That we think as a priority measure, the government should be seeking to provide basic insulation measures for 100,000 homes by 2023. That's really in response to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all the challenges of rising energy bills. And look, there are major benefits there. I'm not going to read all of this out, but there are major benefits right across the EU of prioritizing energy efficiency. It is not cheap, and that's why we think really the lower income households should be prioritized. Again, I won't go through all of this, but we need a phase out of connections to the gas grid and an end to installation of fossil fuel boilers. You may say, dear God, what if my boiler breaks? Are you going to stop me installing a new one? What we need to see here is really a deprioritization of fossil fuel boilers and a prioritization of things like heat pumps and energy efficiency. So the two need to go hand in hand. And last but not least, we need to lead a solar transformation. So that means, and this has already started, supporting installation of solar panels on roofs. Now that's not a silver bullet, but it's definitely a help, you know, and it can provide an impact if Ireland really is bold and ambitious. And okay, that's just an additional slide on the benefits. And lastly, last but not least, and I know I've spoken at some length now, I would suggest, particularly those of you who are intrepid enough, do look at the consultant's summary. Do submit a response. Friends of the Earth is going to do an e-action. It will be on our website with our core recommendations, which you can use. But we would recommend you put in your own views. And I have started a document which you can add to, with useful sources, useful reports, which can perhaps help you writing your own submission. And as I said, it's by the 28th of October. The email address there is energyconsultation@dec.gov.ie, and they accept it by post as well. But I will put the link in the chat now for that. So that is it. I know I've spoken for too long and probably managed to not address all the key points that you wanted to ask about in terms of energy. But if I just bring this up onto the screen, Julia, I don't know if you're there and if you want to speak for 5 minutes about, you know, the risks of LNG, the risks of frack gas.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Yeah.
Can you see me?
I hope so. I hope so now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Walsh. I'm the director of Frack Action and a proud Irish American. My group has been working in Ireland for the past 7 years after we banned fracking here in New York State and working across the US. We helped out with Friends of the Earth and many different campaigners and organizations throughout Ireland to ban fracking in Ireland, which was a great success, thanks to, I'm sure, many of you on the call today. And for the past 3 or so years, have been working to stop the Shannon LNG import terminal that has been proposed for the Shannon estuary to import frack gas from the US. Very close to where I am right now in New York, about 3 hours away in Pennsylvania, to take the frack gas from Pennsylvania, liquefy it, transport it by rail and truck down the Delaware River to a proposed export facility in New Jersey, and then over the Atlantic to Ireland, to the Shannon estuary, to then regasify and burn on site for data centers, not for the Irish energy or electricity supply. So we have been paying very close attention to this and have been working very closely with Friends of the Earth and many different organizations throughout Ireland on stopping Shannon LNG, as we also stop here. Our struggles are very much interlinked, and because Ireland really took a very strong position on banning fracking due to the environmental and public health hazards associated with fracking, which I'm sure many of you know, pollutes the groundwater, pollutes the air, pollutes livestock, and poisons humans, that it would be very hypocritical to then take gas from the United States over and burn it in Ireland. We were very happy to see that the Green Party fought for a policy statement in joining a coalition government with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to stop the importation of US fracked gas, or fracked gas in general, and that this energy security review is a tremendous step forward to stopping all commercial LNG, which would include Shannon LNG and any future LNG terminals. It's very important to us on the front lines of fighting fracking here in the United States that Ireland stop this LNG facility, and that, as Jerry was stating, you know, the political realities over there is that this is a draft. There will be a final. So all of your comments are very important in order to maintain the position in this draft consultant's report that there, you know, that there does not need to be new commercial. And I think further that you wouldn't want the state to be building out new fossil fuel infrastructure. As you all know, the IPCC has stated that any new fossil fuel infrastructure locking us in to burning more fossil fuels will lead us to climate catastrophe. So we have to stop all new infrastructure entirely and build out clean energy infrastructure, which should have been built out many decades ago. But here we are. And so we just wanted to, you know, continue to encourage you all to take a stand with us. It will very much help the fight here. It will help the people who are being impacted and literally, fighting for their lives against this industry. And very much, I think, send a clear signal throughout Europe and the world that we need to switch over to renewables. And Ireland is very much in a global leadership position right now. You're very close to leading the world on renewable energy after maybe lagging a bit for some time, but there's really the potential here for something tremendous. And so we'll be supporting in any ways that we can in the coming weeks. And thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks a lot, Julia, and thanks for coming on. And Julia makes a really important point there that Ireland had previously banned gas from fracking, this really intensive polluting method of getting gas from the ground. Ireland banned that a few years ago, and it would make no sense for Ireland to be taking gas via these LNG ships and importing it to Ireland when that gas, and so much, it's highly likely that that gas which would come across from the US would be from that process of fracking. And it's been fantastic being able to link in with activists and to hear their messages of the reality of extraction of gas on the ground from the US. And the reason we are so focused on this, just in case some people are not aware, is that the owners of or the prospective developers of the Shannon LNG terminal are New Fortress Energy from the US, and US gas is mainly from, or increasingly from this increasingly fracked gas. And just a brief point before we put you into groups is that I am more than aware that a government consultation doesn't always necessarily get people up out of bed in the morning. All this consultation is an opportunity for you to give your views. It will, Friends of the Earth's campaigning will not stop there. The government will have to consider these responses, and the whole process of this review will ultimately lead to some form of a government position. And it's important for you to be aware this is not the end of the process. This is really the start of our campaigning. So I don't want to make people feel that this is all simply about a technical government consultation. Now I'll stop talking. Kevin, we want people to talk. We want people to write.
Hello.
Okay, yes, in the chat there, I put into 2 questions for the breakout room. And next I will share a document where you'll actually be able to put in, you'll be able to put feedback into it. So this is kind of a shared experience that when you get a breakout room, you'll get a number, and it doesn't really matter, we'll figure this out. And that document is where you put in your feedback to those questions. And it might be easier if one person acted as scribe, or whatever way you want to do it, whatever way works best for you.
Yeah, so thanks, Kevin. So just to explain, for about 10 minutes or so, we're going to put you into groups, but the idea is for ye to be given the chance to be able to give your thoughts in response to the 2 questions which Kevin has just put in there. We are not expecting you to write reams of information, but you have the opportunity to respond to those 2 questions. And then after that, we can provide a bit of feedback and go through some of your points and try to answer a few questions. So in other words, you will be put in breakout rooms and you will have the opportunity to respond to those 2 questions in those slides. And then if you want to write any more questions into the chat, and I can ask maybe perhaps at the end if anyone else has any more additional points after I've responded to some of this. So in terms of group 1, so hydro and wave energy, this is not Friends of the Earth saying this is correct, but at the moment, Ireland does not have substantial plans to significantly develop hydro or wave energy. I think, long story short, it's because in terms of infrastructure and potential to rapidly enhance the scale of that infrastructure over a relatively short period and decrease emissions, most of the focus in not only in Ireland but right across Europe is on offshore wind. Now, that is not to say that hydro and wave cannot be part of the solution, but that is the current situation. I would be surprised if there was much in there at all about hydro and wave in the independent technical analysis. That could be something worth raising. I'm going to move on to group 2 now. Need for generators over 2 megawatts to sell into the grid. Data centers could provide data centers could provide their own energy. Yeah, data centers essentially, that there is obligations for data centers to have their own on-site, new data centers have their own on-site generation. Now, unfortunately, that would at the moment amount to a smaller gas-fired generator. So it's really that there needs to be obligations for the development of renewables and battery storage on site is what we need to see. And then, yes, so around renewables, I absolutely agree around the risks of net zero. In order for Ireland to do its fair share, it needs to reach net zero emissions long before 2050, and there cannot be a reliance on unproven technologies. Unproven technologies, as you may have seen, that was that reference I made before to carbon capture and storage. There are other unproven technologies, but there's a real, what we say, moral hazard risk where we wait for these unproven technologies to miraculously arrive. I do not believe nuclear is to be revisited. Blue hydrogen, which I won't go into, but that's essentially hydrogen made from fossil fuels, is another major risk. Where is the carbon usage account for which platforms providing energy to Ireland? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question there. What do you see? There's another question there. What does Friends of the Earth see as a plan or roadmap for prediction of real world demand supply for 2030, 2035? That is a really good question, which we hope this is a plan or a roadmap actually seeing, a zero carbon, for example, electricity system by 2030 or 2035. We intend to produce analysis on that and on risks around demand in the coming weeks. We have consultants working on that for us. In the meantime, sounds like I'm trying to jump past the question, but Wind Energy Ireland, so the network, business network for the wind industry, has produced analysis on that. I'm going to put that into a document, some other useful sources, which I'm going to share with you now before I forget. This is just useful sources to help you write your own response. And moving very quickly, around data centers being asked to use their own supplies. Fracking ban should be maintained, absolutely. There definitely is a risk around a reintroduction of fracking and more exploration in the UK. I think we could all talk for hours about what's going on in the UK. Social housing absolutely should be prioritised for retrofitting, for supports around retrofitting. That's a real core part of Friends of the Earth's campaign. There's absolutely a need for education and also a real need for like a coordinated public communications campaign around energy use and energy security and needing to meet our climate obligations from government. In other words, a public communications campaign from government. Digesters on other energy supplies from waste. That is part of the response as well. It's not going to be a major element, but I think there are significant government plans for that. And I should have said at the start that a new climate action plan is expected from government in November. So this is where the government sets out how it intends to meet its targets. That's something which Friends of the Earth has also been working on, as I'm sure many others have here, in terms of putting into that separate consultation on a new climate action plan. As I said, that's expected in mid-November, and we also have a e-action running on that as well, with core recommendations. Very quickly now, I'm going to speed up. Lowering household demand by PV, speeding up connections to the grid, moratorium on data centers. Yes, these are all things we've Friends of the Earth and others have advocated for. Micro generation, so that's like solar PV, absolutely. Putting costs for communities, like actually grid connection is another. Connecting to the grid is another real challenge. Use of energy in animal agriculture. There are plans, there are new supports for solar on school buildings, but also for businesses and on farms. There's also a big push around use of what's called, generation of biogas or biomethane. There are on farms, that is another, I'd say, can of worms. There's positives, but also some real risks. Data centers to heat housing trades. Yeah, so this idea is around district heat. And district heat, which I don't have time to go into, is used in many other European cities. So waste heat from the likes of factories is used to heat homes. That is part of the solution, and the SEAI has done a lot of work there. Yeah, that's district heating. Yeah, and then LNG plant, not to go any further, increasing grants, focus on solar. Accountability is key around climate goals. It's a great point, whoever made that. Overhaul of public transport, absolutely. That's something we did. I didn't get a time to go into today. And tidal and wave energy, as I said at the start, there hasn't been a major focus on it. Capacity markets, I'm just looking at slide 9 now. We could have an entertaining discussion about that and about capacity markets which are used to sort of support the development of new gas-fired generation. We do need more community-owned renewables, and that is more or less it. Is there anything else? I know people have been writing into the chat box as well. Is there any other questions before we finish up? Might spend 5 minutes or so. Is there? I see Amanda has raised her hand. Amanda, do you have a question?
Hi, Cherry. Hi, everyone. I have a question, and then basically have a bit of contribution as well, because I know in our group, which is group 1, we made mention of the hydropower station. Okay, and your response to that was the infrastructure, is not there, so the government will not want to maybe invest on that sector. So I just want to draw you back to what we're talking about there. We're actually looking at the water main, okay, and this station has been in existence since, if you check it, since 619 AD. It's a renewable way of creating electricity. Okay, why is a short term? So I'll kind of use it as a short term, because what we need now is a short term, because we know the offshore wind turbine, is going definitely, according to the statistic, is going to be covering about 100% of the electricity that is needed. Okay, based on where we are located in Europe. So right now, what Ireland needs is a short term, because we know that will take about almost 10 years to develop before, from the beginning to the end. Almost, we're looking at 10 years, okay, minimum 10 years. So we are looking at short term. What is the short term solution? So I think that should be our target. And wind, what's called water, the hydro station is actually, you know, a very quick development. Is all it takes is just the wind turbine, which everybody is familiar with. And we have so many of these in, even here in Clare, and I've seen 2 around, you know, mini windmill that was used before and just kind of abandoned now. They just left there. I don't think it's still working, but I think in most counties they have it. I just think what the government needs to do is look deep into those counties and see the one that is still working, and then maybe create more of it, and then have something like the micro stations. Okay, you showed us earlier the pipeline, the connections that is already there. So with the micro stations that we have, then we can have all this electricity, you know, that has been generated connected to the line as well. So that we cover the short term that we're looking at. So that's just my suggestion, just to clarify what we're talking about in the group 1. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. And look, I know that is something that has been progressed in other European countries. It's not my area of expertise, but that's not to say it can't be a solution. But I think Ireland is more so, it is ultimately more so putting its eggs in the offshore wind basket. Now, I think another issue we could talk about is the importance also of like solar and energy efficiency, even though they're not as, what's the word? They're not going to reduce emissions as much and don't save as much electricity. Having said that, they're really important for public buy-in as well. We could all have a discussion around public buy-in. And I just want to look, I'm just looking at the chat box here. Murray has done a lot of work in this area and on energy security. So Murray, that's the MAREI, our research centre in University College Cork. They've done a lot of great work and good analysis around energy security and around solar. They recently had a very good report on solar. Green hydrogen, absolutely. Green hydrogen can actually be developed from renewables. I guess the issue is some in the gas industries will sort of suggest that hydrogen will solve all our problems, but the reality is, without going into the details, it's highly likely that we will only have sufficient volumes of green hydrogen available to decarbonize certain industries. In other words, it's not a like-for-like replacement with natural gas. And I think we've touched on some of these issues before. I'm going through the chat box. About keeping data centers off grid.
Sorry, I just wanted to say it's very confusing, and I know there's so much there, and it's hard even for this community to get its thinking clear, and then as to what to communicate, because I think it's really important that like there was a focus on LNG, and of course that pressure still needs to remain there to make sure that the government don't roll back and that this doesn't happen. But we have to look at our own energy security in terms of what we put our energy into around communicating something of this and how we get it across clearly so that people don't switch off literally, you know, when we start talking about it. And then, you know, the communication has to be maybe simplified a little bit more and become a little bit clearer, because you know, what was said was that the security of our gas supply is not the same as the security of our electricity supply, and this needs to be communicated and clarified effectively. Otherwise, and I suppose the other thing is that in a way it could be a little bit of a red herring, because, you know, we're not in charge of our own security, and we're not going to be for another 20 or 30 years, realistically speaking. So how can this be used to communicate or to help figure out what's the priority or what's most important to get across and what isn't, and where we put our energy security into fighting this. Because if we're all over the place, you know, with all these different aspects, then we might as well not be expending a lot of energy in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I just, you know, and that's what I mean. It's only the beginning of this, but there has to be some kind of eventual process where there's a clarity of thinking around what messages we want to get across. And, you know, not just in these responses, but also to the media in terms of, you know, the data centers and the demands from them. I mean, that's one simple thing that we can sort of bang on about, if you like, but also, you know, resources for homes to be insulated or solar panels or whatever. And then for people and everyone, you know, thinking in terms of reducing possible potential consumption, because otherwise, we're going to have no energy security in terms of what we put into this.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I agree with so much of what you said. I also appreciate that it is quite confusing because energy security touches on so much of our electricity and gas and heat and transport systems that it rapidly goes in about 174 different directions at the same time. But there is a definite need for 4 recommendations that we can all get behind, including, as you said, for the likes of moratorium on data centers, a rejection of LNG, a focus on demand reduction. And I think the government does have a role to play in communicating some of these issues, some of these pressures on, particularly actually on our electricity grid, really underline the need for a significant focus on energy efficiency and on reducing demand, reducing consumption. Yeah. And it's not actually that the pressure shouldn't all simply be on households, but I think there is definitely a need for improved government communication on this as well. And look, is there anything else? I'm conscious that we're now over time. Is there? Thanks for that, Anna. Was there anything else that someone wanted to question or another point someone wanted to make?
Apologies for being late. Will there be a recording of this webinar going out later?
There will be. Yes, there will, Connor. Yep. Yep. And there's a gentleman there called Lynch. I don't know your first name. I don't know if you can unmute there.
Pat is my name.
Pat, hi.
Now, what I was concerned about is where Shannon is still